My name is Zara Whitmore. I am 65 years old, a widow, and until recently I spent most of my days tending the garden behind the great white-stone mansion my late husband built for us. That house was more than walls and windows. It carried the echo of our shared laughter, the scars of our quarrels, the scent of holidays filled with family, and the quiet nights when Richard and I would sit together, hands clasped, certain that we had built a life no storm could shake. I thought I knew the shape of my days ahead, quiet ones, marked by memory and the slow rhythm of healing. But on the morning of Richard's funeral, everything I believed about family was split wide open. The church smelled of lilies and candle wax. People whispered, pressing my hands with sympathy, their eyes full of pity. I stood near the casket, holding myself steady. Richard's absence was a canyon inside me, but I reminded myself to stay calm, to honor him with dignity. I thought the pain of burying my husband would be the sharpest wound of the day. I was wrong. As the minister spoke of Richard's generosity, my son Ezra rose from the pew. He was only 35, tall like his father, but his eyes carried something restless, almost fevered. Guests turned to look at him, perhaps expecting a son's tribute, a kind word for the man who raised him. Instead, his voice rang through the church like a stone striking glass. "The $70 million mansion is mine," he declared. His hand trembled, not from grief, but from triumph. "My father built it for me, and I'll claim it now. Nothing is left for you, Mother." The room fell silent, the words crashing down heavier than the toll of any bell. I felt every guest inhale and hold their breath, as if afraid that even the smallest sound would shatter the moment further. Faces froze, shock, disbelief, then pity once more, but this time for me. I saw mouths part in astonishment. One woman whispered to another, too stunned to hide her words. Did he just disinherit his own mother at his father's funeral? A man near the aisle shook his head. Someone else gasped, and that single sharp intake of breath seemed to echo through the vaulted ceiling. Ezra didn't falter. He looked directly at me, his jaw tight, as though daring me to resist. For a moment I could not move. My knees felt weak, and my heart pounded as if it wanted to break free from my chest. I remembered the boy who used to hold my hand when thunder frightened him. I remembered the young man who promised to make his father proud. But standing before me now was someone else, someone sharpened by hunger and debt. Guests began murmuring, uneasy, their heads swiveling between him and me. The minister stammered, lost for words. The air was heavy, like a storm pressing against the stained glass windows. I rose slowly, clutching the folder Richard's lawyer had given me only days earlier. My fingers brushed the leather cover, its weight grounding me. I did not speak, not yet. But before I could gather the strength, another voice cut through the thick silence. From the back of the church, a familiar figure stepped forward. It was Mr. Dalton, our family lawyer, his silver hair catching the light. He walked with measured steps, the sound of his shoes steady against the marble floor. He came to stand beside me, looked at Ezra, and in a voice that carried like thunder said, "Not today." Ezra froze. The flush of victory drained from his face, leaving a paleness that told me he understood something had shifted. The guests leaned forward in their pews, straining to catch the current between fatherless widow and only son. For a heartbeat, I felt the church itself hold its breath again. I did not gloat nor cry. I simply met my son's eyes, letting him see that I was not broken. My silence became its own kind of answer. If you are listening to this and feel the chill of betrayal pierce through the warmth of memory, stay with me. What happened in that church was only the beginning. This story is not just about wealth or inheritance. It is about the cost of silence, the weight of dignity, and the strength a woman can find when she has nothing left but herself. And if you have ever faced moments when those closest to you turned into strangers, I invite you to walk this path with me. Subscribe, share, or simply stay close as the story unfolds, because what came after that frozen moment will change everything. When Mr. Dalton's words fell into the stillness of the church, it was as if the entire room snapped awake. Not today. 3 small words, yet they seemed to split the air like lightning. My son, who only a moment ago stood tall in arrogance, blinked rapidly as though he had misheard. He opened his mouth, but no sound came. For the first time in years, Ezra looked uncertain, and that brief hesitation was enough to shift the ground beneath both of us. I gripped the back of the pew for balance, the cool wood biting into my palm. Around me, the guests exhaled all at once, a chorus of whispers rising in the vaulted sanctuary. Some leaned forward, their eyes wide, eager for the confrontation unfolding before them. Others shook their heads, disgust mixing with sympathy. I could feel the tide turning, and yet I kept my composure. This was Richard's funeral. His casket lay not 10 feet away. I would not dishonor his memory by losing control, no matter how deep my son's betrayal cut. Ezra recovered enough to sneer. "You're bluffing," he spat, his voice trembling at the edges. "You have nothing. Father wanted me to have the mansion, and you know it. Everyone knows it." He looked around as if searching for allies among the mourners, but no one moved to support him. The air was thick with judgment. Dalton stepped closer, his posture calm, his voice measured. "Your father made his intentions clear, Ezra. You may shout them down in this holy place, but truth does not bend to your will." Rested a hand lightly on the folder I held, a silent reassurance that I was not alone. My son's eyes darted from the folder to my face, as though trying to read whether I had the strength to oppose him. He underestimated me. He always had. For years, he treated me as though I were fragile, easily swayed, a mother clinging to sentiment. But in that moment, I felt Richard's presence steadying me. I straightened my back and met Ezra's gaze. "I am your mother," I said quietly, my voice low but steady enough to reach every corner of the church. "And I am still standing." The hush that followed was heavy, almost reverent. Ezra's lips pressed into a thin line, his nostrils flaring as though he had been struck. He turned toward Dalton, desperate now. "You think a lawyer's tricks will scare me? That house is mine." She has no claim Dalton didn't flinch. "Not today," he repeated, softer this time, but no less resolute. It was then I noticed Claudia in the second row, her perfectly painted lips curled in a smirk. She was younger than Ezra by nearly a decade, sharp-eyed and hungry, the kind of woman who measured affection by the size of a bank account. Her hand rested on Ezra's arm as if to steady him, but I saw the calculation in her eyes. She was already weighing what his bravado might cost her. The minister, pale and flustered, attempted to regain control of the service. Perhaps we should return to the eulogy." His words faltered when Ezra snapped. "No, this is my father's legacy. I won't be silenced." But he was silenced, in a way, by the sheer power of stillness around him. The guests were no longer just observers. They were witnesses. Every eye recorded his cruelty. Every heart judged him. He could not escape the truth that he had laid bare his greed at his father's funeral, before God, family, and community. My breath steadied. I thought of Richard's last smile, the way he had pressed my hand in the hospital bed, whispering, "You will know when to speak." I understood then. Silence was not weakness. It was preparation. Ezra tried again to rally. "Mother has always been soft. She cannot hold on to the estate. She doesn't know how to protect it. She never did." His words were venom wrapped in false confidence. I stepped forward. My heels clicked against the marble floor, each sound sharp, deliberate. I did not need to raise my voice. "This is not about softness, Ezra," I said. "It is about respect. Respect for your father, respect for the life we built together, and respect for yourself, which you seem so eager to discard." Gasps fluttered through the congregation. For the first time since he stood, Ezra faltered, his chest rising and falling with uneven breaths. Claudia's hand slipped from his arm, her eyes narrowing as if she already questioned the strength of her partner. Dalton gave a small nod, the kind only I noticed, as if to remind me the foundation was already in place. He had prepared, Richard had prepared, and now all I had to do was stand firm. The silence stretched, broken only by the faint rustle of dresses and suits. A woman near the aisle whispered, "She has her husband's courage." Her words reached me, threading through the tension like a thread of light. Ezra's shoulders slumped, only for a second before pride forced them back upright. He jabbed a finger toward the folder. "Show them then." "If you truly have something, show them." I did not. Not yet. There would be a time and a place for everything, and Richard had taught me that patience could be its own weapon. Instead, I closed my fingers more tightly around the folder and returned to my seat. The weight of it rested in my lap like a secret waiting to be unveiled. The guests, sensing the shift, began to murmur again, this time with sympathy rather than shock. The minister cleared his throat, resumed the eulogy, and the service moved forward, though the air still hummed with what had been revealed. My son sat rigid, his pride wounded, his face pale beneath the dim light of stained glass. I looked at the casket, at Richard's still form, and I felt a strange calm. This was only the beginning. The storm had been called forth, and there was no turning back. Yet beneath the grief, beneath the betrayal, a quiet resolve grew. For the first time since his passing, I felt Richard beside me, urging me to be strong. Ezra thought he had won by speaking first. What he did not yet understand was that victory does not belong to the loudest voice. Sometimes it belongs to the one who can wait in silence, steady and unyielding, until the right moment comes. As I sat back down in the pew, the weight of the folder firm in my lap, my mind drifted to a time long before the bitterness of this day, back to when Richard and I first began weaving the threads of our life together. Memories have a way of rushing in when grief cracks the present wide open. The church, with its dark wooden beams and somber faces, blurred before me, and I saw instead a younger version of myself, laughing as the wind whipped through my hair on the porch of a small, crumbling house we rented when we first married. Richard was beside me, his shirt sleeves rolled up, sweat dripping from his brow, his hands calloused from long days building the foundation of a dream. He used to say that love was not only felt but built brick by brick. He wanted a home that reflected that truth, a place that would endure when everything else fell away. I remember the moment he first pointed to the stretch of land where the mansion would someday rise. It was nothing but rolling fields, grass bending in the wind, the soil rich and waiting. His eyes shone with a fire I had rarely seen in a man, not the fire of greed but of purpose. "Here, Zara," he said, his hand resting lightly on my shoulder. "Here is where we'll build a house that no storm can touch. But more than stone, it will hold our memories, our quarrels, our joys. This house must be stronger than us because one day it will need to carry you when I cannot." I laughed then, teasing him about his dramatic words. But even as I laughed, I believed him. Richard never built anything without pouring his whole soul into it. The mansion began as sketches on worn paper, corners smudged with pencil and the scent of coffee clinging to them. Night after night, we sat at the kitchen table, our heads bent together as he drew lines that would one day become hallways, staircases, rooms filled with light. I suggested where the windows should be, insisting on wide panes in the sitting room so I could watch the seasons change. He nodded, agreeing, saying that I saw what he missed. The years blurred as walls rose, scaffolding climbed, and the echo of hammers rang through the air. I planted roses near the entrance while Richard argued with contractors about arches and beams. He worked tirelessly, as though the mansion was more than a house, as though it was a promise he was desperate to fulfill. And in truth, it was. When the house was finally complete, we walked through it hand in hand. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, scattering across the polished floor. The staircase curved upward, like an invitation to climb toward dreams. Richard stopped in the great hall, his eyes sweeping across the space, and I saw tears glisten there. He pulled me close, whispering, "This mansion is our legacy, Zara. It must never fall into the hands of greed. It is not for those who see only its price tag. It is for love, for dignity, for the family who will cherish it." Those words stayed with me, etched deeper than the lines of stone in the walls. I often repeated them to myself in the years that followed, especially when Ezra was young. I hoped he would inherit not just the building, but the meaning Richard poured into it. There were evenings when Ezra, still a boy with scraped knees and boundless curiosity, would race through the halls, his laughter bouncing off the walls. Richard would catch him mid-run, scoop him up and say, "Remember, son, this house is built from your mother's heart as much as mine. Respect it. Respect her." At the time, Ezra nodded solemnly as though he understood. I never imagined those lessons would vanish from his memory so completely. But as time passed, the mansion grew not only as a symbol of our love, but as a stage for our struggles. There were nights when Richard and I quarreled under its roof, our voices carrying up the grand staircase, only to reconcile hours later in the quiet of our room. There were Christmas mornings when laughter and wrapping paper filled the halls, and nights when sorrow pressed heavy, like when we lost Richard's brother, and the house seemed to absorb our grief with its walls. Yet always the mansion endured, steady and silent, a keeper of both our joys and our pains. I thought of the letter Richard left me, though I had not yet opened it. I suspected it carried the same spirit he had voiced so often, that the mansion was more than inheritance, more than value counted in dollars. It was built to be a refuge, a sanctuary, not a prize to be fought over. He had warned me often, "One day, Ezra will have to choose between respect and hunger. If he chooses hunger, the mansion cannot be his salvation." Those words now returned with an ache as I sat in the church. Ezra had made his choice. He stood before the world and chose hunger, ambition, debt. He chose to claim the mansion not with reverence, but with entitlement. And I, who had planted its first roses, who had scrubbed its floors when money was tight, who had walked every hallway with Richard's hand in mine, I was told in front of strangers that nothing was left for me. The memory of Richard's voice soothed me, though. He had foreseen this, perhaps not the exact scene, but the possibility of betrayal. His foresight had been both a blessing and a burden, for now I carried the responsibility of honoring his vision. I let my eyes close in the church, not to escape, but to remember more clearly. I could see Richard, younger, strong, lifting beams with his workers. I could hear him laugh as I spilled paint on my dress while trying to help. I could feel his arm around me as he whispered late at night that everything he built was for us. "Never let anyone take it from you lightly," he said once, his voice low but fierce. Now, decades later, I sat beneath stained glass, surrounded by mourners, with my son turned stranger across the aisle. The mansion had become more than a house, more than an inheritance. It was the test of our family, the measure of whether love or greed would endure. I opened my eyes again, feeling the burn of grief, but also the steel of resolve. If Richard had built the mansion to carry me when he no longer could, then I would not let it be wrested from me by the very son we had raised within its walls. The memory of our marriage, our labor, and our home became my armor. Ezra thought his claim would leave me shaken, but all it did was remind me of the strength already laid into every brick, every arch, every rose bush that still bloomed by the gates. And if Richard could see me now, I prayed he would know that his trust had not been misplaced. There was a time when Ezra's laughter could fill the mansion like sunlight. I remember his boyish grin, the way he would run through the corridors with a toy airplane in his hand, pretending to soar through skies only he could see. He once curled up on the old leather armchair in Richard's study, asking questions about law, history, even architecture, as though he wanted to absorb every piece of knowledge his father could give him. I held on to those memories for so long, even when evidence of his change began to grow impossible to ignore. It started slowly. In college, Ezra called less often, his visits home rushed, his eyes darting when I asked how classes were going. Richard said he was simply becoming independent, but a mother feels the shift before anyone else does. There was a distance in his voice, a sharpness when money was mentioned. At first, we thought it was the usual struggle of a young man trying to prove himself, but the truth was more corrosive. Ezra wasn't building his own life. He was leaning on the idea that one day everything we had built would fall into his lap. I remember the first time he asked for a loan. He spoke with charm, leaning across the table, insisting it was temporary, just a small setback. He wanted to invest in a business, he said. Richard's brow furrowed, but he agreed, hoping to give his son a chance to stand on his own. That money vanished, and soon another request followed, then another. Each time his excuses grew thinner, his promises louder. Richard warned him, "You cannot build a life by waiting for others to hand it to you." But Ezra would smile and say, "One day the mansion will be mine, and everything will be different." Claudia entered his life around then. She was striking, the kind of woman who drew every gaze in a room. Her beauty was sharp-edged, like glass that glitters even as it cuts. Ezra paraded her through the mansion on holidays, showing her every room as if he already owned the place. She would run her fingers along the banisters, her eyes calculating, and she would whisper to him, not quietly enough for me to miss, "Imagine what we could do with this house." Imagine the parties, the influence I saw, the way her words sank into him, feeding the ambition already growing unchecked. By the time Richard fell ill, Ezra's debts were no longer whispered troubles, but heavy burdens that followed him everywhere. Men came calling, their suits crisp, their smiles cold, the kind of men whose favors always carried hidden blades. Ezra spoke faster during those days, promising he had things under control, promising he had investments lined up. But when I looked into his eyes, I saw only desperation. One evening, I overheard him on the phone in the study, his voice low, harsh. He was pleading, not negotiating. "The mansion is mine," he said. "I'll use it to clear everything. Just wait until it transfers. I'll pay you then." My breath caught. It wasn't an argument anymore. It was his lifeline, his leverage. He was gambling with a house that did not yet belong to him, the house Richard and I had built with our hands, our hearts, and our years. When I confronted him later that night, he brushed me off with a smile that no longer held warmth. "Don't worry, Mother," he said, slipping his arm around my shoulder, as though comfort could mask deceit. "Father wanted me to have the mansion. It's as good as mine. Once it's official, everything will be fine." His voice carried that same restless energy, the kind that told me he wasn't convincing me. He was convincing himself. Claudia's influence sharpened his. Greed. She dressed in gowns that shimmered under the chandelier light and spoke of future plans as though they were certainties. "Ezra, when the mansion is finally yours, we'll be unstoppable," she cooed, her hand sliding along his arm. I watched from across the room, my stomach tightening. I saw the way he basked in her admiration, mistaking her ambition for love. Richard, though weakened by illness, tried once more to reach him. "Ezra," he said gently from his bed, his voice rough but clear, "this house is not a bargaining chip. It is not a prize for the loudest claimant. If you treat it as such, you will lose more than you can imagine." But Ezra's eyes slid away, his jaw set stubbornly. He had already chosen his path. The day before Richard passed, Ezra came into the bedroom where I sat, holding my husband's hand. He barely looked at his father. Instead, he asked, "When will the papers be signed? When will everything be transferred?" My heart broke. My husband's chest rose with slow, painful breaths, and our son could only speak of ownership. I wanted to scream, to shake him, to make him remember the boy who once asked questions about honor and history, but instead I whispered, "Your father is still alive. Show him love, not greed." Ezra frowned, impatient. "Love doesn't pay debts, Mother." "The mansion," well, then he turned and left, the sound of the door clicking shut, more final than I wanted to admit. That was when I realized the boy I had raised was gone, replaced by a man who measured his worth, not by character, but by possession. He had already mortgaged his conscience against promises he could not keep. And now, at his father's funeral, he believed he was merely claiming what he had long considered his. As I sat in the church, remembering those moments, I felt both sorrow and clarity. Ezra was not only my son, he had become the embodiment of every warning Richard had ever spoken. He was not driven only by desire. He was trapped by choices, by debts, by the hunger that gnawed at him until he saw nothing but the mansion as salvation. And yet, even as grief pressed on me, another thought hardened in my chest. The mansion was never meant to save him. It was built to shelter love, to guard dignity, to honor a marriage that had endured storms. Richard's voice echoed again in my memory. It must never fall into the hands of greed. I opened my eyes and looked at Ezra across the pews. His face was drawn tight, his jaw clenched, Claudia whispering into his ear. He believed he was moments away from seizing everything. He believed I would crumble. He believed wrong. Richard had always been a man who thought ahead, not out of fear, but out of the quiet certainty that storms come, whether we want them to or not. Long before his illness dimmed the fire in his eyes, he began speaking with Dalton about how to preserve what we had built. I remember the night he first mentioned it to me. We sat in the study, the fire crackling low in the hearth, and he said, "Zara, a house can be stolen if it is only walls and deeds. But if it is placed within the shelter of trust, then it becomes something no one can touch." At the time, I only nodded, not fully understanding the depth of his foresight. Dalton visited often in those months. He would arrive with his leather briefcase, his glasses perched low on his nose, and spread papers across the desk with meticulous care. Richard and he would speak for hours, their voices low, sometimes pausing so Richard could catch his breath. I often stood in the doorway, unseen, watching the two men bent over documents, the weight of responsibility heavy between them. I realized later that Dalton was not just preparing legal papers, he was becoming the guardian of Richard's final promise to me. One evening, Richard called me into the study. Dalton was there, his pen poised above a page, his expression grave but calm. Richard reached for my hand and placed it on the folder before us. "This," he said, "is our safeguard. No matter what Ezra believes, no matter what words he shouts, this mansion will remain yours. It is locked in trust, beyond the reach of greed or desperation." His hand trembled, but his eyes held steady on mine. "I cannot protect you with my strength anymore, Zara. But I can protect you with this." I felt a sting in my throat, both from sorrow and from the fierce love behind his preparation. I had always trusted Richard, but in that moment, I understood how deeply he had trusted me. He believed I would carry not just the papers, but the will to stand when the time came. Dalton cleared his throat softly and explained the layers of protection, the clauses written with precision, the foresight to guard against loopholes. His words blurred together for me. I was not a lawyer, nor did I need to be. What I understood was simple. Richard had already built the shield I would one day need. Dalton slipped the completed document into a folder lined with dark leather, the edges worn from his own hands. He closed it firmly and said, "Keep this near you. It is more than paper. It is a fortress." Richard gave a small smile, weary but proud, and leaned back in his chair. I kissed his hand, grateful beyond words, though sorrow pressed against me like a tide. After Richard passed, Dalton returned quietly, without fanfare, as though honoring the gravity of his role. He handed me the same folder, now heavier in my grasp than ever before. "It is safe, Mrs. Whitmore," he said. "Your husband saw far enough ahead to leave you not just with memories, but with protection." I nodded, unable to speak, clutching it to my chest as though it were a piece of Richard himself. That folder lay across my lap at the funeral when Ezra made his declaration. He saw it, but did not understand what it contained. To him, it was only paper, perhaps a relic of his father's estate. He could not imagine the strength it held. And, though my heart broke at the sight of my only son turning into a stranger before me, I felt Richard's foresight steadying my hand. I think back to those nights in the study often, the way the lamplight caught the silver in Richard's hair, the way Dalton's pen scratched quietly across parchment. It was not a battle I was witnessing then. It was preparation for a day Richard feared he would not live to see. He had been right. That day came sooner than I could bear. And yet, because of his foresight, I did not sit defenseless in the pews. I sat with a fortress on my lap, built of ink and law and love. Ezra thought he had cornered me. He believed words alone could strip me of dignity and inheritance. What he never understood was that Richard had been sowing seeds of protection long before Ezra's greed took root. I only had to hold steady until the moment came to reveal it. As I glanced down at the folder, the leather warm under my palm, I whispered inwardly, "Thank you, Richard." I could almost feel his hand covering mine again, steady, reassuring, as if he were still here guiding me. I was not alone. I never truly would be. The funeral ended with hymns, sung softly, though the words felt hollow after what had taken place. The mourners filed out slowly, casting glances in my direction, some filled with pity, others with admiration. I kept my head high, my hand resting on the folder as if it were part of me. Ezra avoided my gaze, speaking instead in low whispers to Claudia and the lawyer he had brought along. I did not strain to hear. His schemes were already in motion, but so was my resolve. When the last note of the organ faded, I walked down the aisle alone. Every step echoed against the stone floor, deliberate, steady. The air outside was cool, a breeze brushing against my face, carrying with it the faint scent of lilies from the churchyard. I paused at the steps, looking out over the line of black cars waiting to take the mourners back to their lives. My life, I knew, would never be the same. Dalton came to stand beside me. His presence was quiet but firm, like an oak tree at my shoulder. "You don't need to answer him yet," he said. "Silence is its own power." I nodded, understanding more than I could say. I had spent much of my life speaking softly, letting others fill the room with their noise. Now that silence became a shield. I did not need to match Ezra's shouting. I only needed to hold fast until the time was right. I returned to the mansion that evening, the house feeling both familiar and foreign without Richard's presence. The room seemed to sigh, shadows stretching longer than usual, as if the very walls knew what storm had been unleashed. I walked through each room slowly, my hand brushing over the furniture, the banisters, the framed photographs that chronicled decades of family life. In every corner, I could feel Richard's hand guiding me. This was not just a house. It was memory, love, promise. Ezra had shouted that it was his, but the mansion itself seemed to resist him, as though its stones remembered who had built it and why. I stood before Richard's portrait in the great hall. His eyes, painted with care years ago, looked out at me with quiet strength. "You knew this would happen," I whispered. "You gave me the means to endure, but it is my turn to act." The silence of the hall wrapped around me, not empty but steady, like a vow. That night, I did not cry. Instead, I sat at Richard's desk with the folder open before me. Dalton's careful words echoed in my mind, the protections layered within the documents like bricks in a wall. Ezra could shout, scheme, even threaten, but he could not penetrate what Richard had already secured. All I needed was the courage to wait, to stand my ground, to let the truth emerge in its own time. Claudia's laughter drifted faintly through my memory, sharp and careless. Ezra's words at the funeral still rang in my ears, but instead of wounding me further, they clarified everything. My son had chosen his path. My role was no longer to shield him from consequence, but to hold steady as those consequences reached him. It hurt to think of it that way, but love is not the same as indulgence. Richard had warned me, "Mercy without boundaries turns to weakness. Strength, Zara, is knowing when silence speaks louder than words." I closed the folder, tied the leather strap carefully, and placed it back in the drawer where Richard had once kept his most private letters. My hand lingered on it for a moment before I turned the key. The lock clicked, small but final. For the first time since the funeral began, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. Later, as I prepared for bed, I looked out from the balcony toward the darkened gardens. The roses I had planted decades ago swayed in the night wind. They had withstood storms, frost, and neglect, yet each spring they bloomed again, fragrant and defiant. I thought of myself in the same way. I was no longer young, no longer shielded by Richard's arm, but I was not broken. I would bloom again, even if the season was harsh. Ezra's betrayal cut deeply, yet I knew I could not collapse beneath it. The mansion had been built to endure, and so had I. Silence, resolve, patience, these would be my weapons. When the time came, the truth would stand taller than his lies. Until then, I would remain steady, holding the line Richard had drawn for us both. I lay down that night with the sound of the wind against the windows and the steady rhythm of my heart, reminding me that I was still here, still capable, still strong. Ezra thought he had stripped me of everything, but he had overlooked the most important thing of all. I had not lost myself. I had always known that Ezra's hunger would drive him further than reason could follow, but I did not realize just how quickly he would set his plans into motion. Only days after the funeral, while I still moved through the Aia mansion like a ghost, he was already plotting. I later learned of his meeting with Mr. Blackwood, a man whose reputation was whispered in legal circles with both fear and disdain. Blackwood was ambitious, clever, and ruthless, the kind of lawyer who could twist words until they barely resembled the truth, and Ezra clung to him like a drowning man to driftwood. Ezra brought Claudia with him to that meeting. I could picture it as clearly as if I had been there. Claudia, draped in a crimson dress, her hair swept back, her smile sharp enough to cut glass. She sat close to Ezra, her hand resting possessively on his arm, as though to remind him that her future depended entirely on his success. Blackwood welcomed them into his office, a place lined with books that had little to do with justice and everything to do with leverage. The three of them sat together, plotting not only how to seize the mansion, but how to cast me aside in the process. Ezra leaned forward, his voice urgent, his hands restless. My father wanted me to inherit the estate. She's clinging to it out of spite. You've seen cases like this? Can't we push her out? His desperation was disguised as arrogance, but I could hear the truth in every word. He was cornered by debts and driven by fear of collapse. Claudia's eyes gleamed as she added, "This is bigger than sentiment. That house is worth $70 million. Imagine the power of securing it." Blackwood studied them, tapping his pen against the desk. "Inheritance cases are rarely clean," he said, "but sentiment counts for little in court. If we can argue that your mother is incapable of maintaining such an estate, if we can suggest mismanagement, then public opinion might sway in your favor." His voice was smooth, practiced, as though he had sold this same strategy to countless desperate clients. Ezra nodded eagerly, seizing on every word. "Yes, that's it. She's too old, too fragile. She doesn't understand business. That house will fall apart under her." He spoke as though I were a stranger, as though the years I had spent caring for the mansion meant nothing. I had kept it alive through Richard's long absences, through financial strains, through illness. Yet my own son was ready to paint me as weak before the world. Claudia leaned in, her perfume cloying, her tone persuasive. "Once it's in your name, Ezra, everything changes. We'll host events, make the place shine. No one will remember the old woman's claim. They'll only see you as the rightful heir." She kissed his cheek as though sealing the deal with her approval. But Blackwood was not blind. He saw Ezra's desperation, and men like him never worked without recognizing opportunity. "Of course," he said, "this will require resources. Filing the petition, managing the press, ensuring the right narratives are spread, it all costs money." Ezra stiffened at the mention of money, but Claudia squeezed his hand, silently urging him forward. "Do it," she whispered. "We can't back down now." I imagined Ezra hesitating for only a moment before agreeing. He was too deep in debt to retreat, too entangled in Claudia's promises to admit weakness. And so he placed his future in Blackwood's hands, convincing himself that aggression would bring victory. He forgot that the louder a man shouts, the more clearly the world can hear the cracks in his voice. That night, as I walked the halls of the mansion, I felt the shift in the air, as though the house itself knew it had become the center of a battlefield. I paused at the window overlooking the gardens, the roses swaying gently in the moonlight. Richard had planted the first bush with his own hands, telling me that roses were stubborn. They thrived despite the thorns. I placed my palm against the cold glass and whispered, "I will not let him turn this into a prize. It is not his salvation. It is our legacy." I knew Ezra was preparing to strike harder, to paint me as incapable. I could see it in the way he avoided me, the way he whispered with Claudia, the restless phone calls I overheard as he paced the driveway. His ambition was no longer hidden. It radiated from him, sharp and desperate. He believed Blackwood would hand him victory, that Claudia's encouragement was loyalty rather than self-interest. But I knew better. Richard once told me that ambition without honor is like fire without a hearth. It burns everything it touches, leaving nothing but ash. Ezra was feeding that fire, and soon it would consume not only him but everyone foolish enough to stand too close. I sat in Richard's old chair that evening, the folder still locked away but never far from reach. Ezra thought he had found his weapon in Blackwood. What he did not realize was that Richard had given me mine long before. All I had to do was wait. The weight of carrying everything alone pressed heavier with each passing day. Ezra's movements grew bolder, his arrogance feeding on Claudia's whispers and Blackwood's strategies. Though the mansion felt like a fortress around me, I knew fortresses could fall if no one stood beside their keeper. It was then I reached for the people who had always offered me strength, not through wealth or ambition, but through loyalty and wisdom. Helen Moore had been my closest friend for more than 3 decades. We first met when she presided as a judge, and I stood beside Richard during one of his earliest business disputes. Even then, her sharp eyes seemed to see through everything, past the bluster of lawyers and the noise of arguments. Over the years, she became not only my confidant but also the anchor I leaned on when storms threatened to pull me under. I called her one gray morning, my voice low but steady. "Helen, I need you." There was no hesitation in her reply. "I'll be there within the hour." When she arrived, she carried with her not just her experience, but the comfort of someone who had weathered her own battles and survived. She sat across from me at the long oak table in the mansion's kitchen, her hands folded, her eyes unflinching. "Ezra has declared war on you," she said simply, as though she had been in the church that day, though I had already told her every detail. "But you are not without defense. You have Dalton, you have Richard's foresight, and you have yourself. That man raised you higher than you know, Zara. Do not forget it." Her voice steadied me more than she could realize. She brought Lily with her, her granddaughter, a law student with a sharp mind and boundless energy. Lily was nothing like Ezra. Her ambition carried no greed, only a hunger to learn and to see justice carried out. She walked through the mansion with bright eyes, studying the architecture, running her fingers along the carved wood banisters, as though she could feel the history pulsing within. Over tea, she asked questions quickly, her notebook open, her pen racing. "Has Ezra shown any written claim? Have there been creditors reaching out? Do you know the extent of his financial entanglements?" Her youth brought urgency, her words spilling over each other, but her eyes shone with determination. Helen placed a calming hand on her arm, reminding her to slow down, but I found comfort in her energy. It reminded me that new generations could carry the torch when we grew weary. I admitted what I had overheard weeks earlier, Ezra speaking of debts and promising the mansion as collateral. Lily's eyes sharpened, her jaw tightening. "That could mean more than simple loans," she said. "If he's dealing with men outside the banks, there may be evidence of illegal debt arrangements. If we can find proof, it will not only weaken his claim, but expose his recklessness." Helen leaned forward, her voice calm but firm. "You cannot let your love for him blind you to what he has become. If he has tied himself to criminals, that is his choice. Your responsibility now is to protect yourself, to honor Richard's vision. Ezra must answer for his decisions, not you." Her words pierced me, not with cruelty, but with the sharp truth of someone who loved me too much to let me waver. I realized then how deeply I needed them both. Dalton could carry the legal shield, but Helen carried my spirit, reminding me of who I was beyond grief and betrayal. Lily carried the spark of pursuit, eager to uncover what hid beneath Ezra's arrogance. Together they formed something I had not felt in weeks, a circle of protection around me. Later that afternoon, Lily asked permission to go through some of the documents Richard had stored in the study. She pored over financial records, her brows knitting as she pieced together clues. Hours passed, the sun dipping lower, the mansion filling with shadows, until she looked up with a sharp breath. "Here," she said, tapping the page. "This isn't just credit card debt or business losses. These are private loans. The signatures don't match standard lenders. He's tied to people who don't forgive easily." My stomach turned cold. I had feared as much, but hearing it spoken aloud confirmed what I dreaded. Ezra wasn't just reckless, he was desperate. He had promised the mansion as a lifeline not only to his pride, but to men whose threats could reach much further than courts. Helen watched me closely, her eyes steady. "Do you see now? This isn't about family anymore. It's about survival, dignity, and law. He's put himself in a cage and he wants to drag you into it with him. You cannot step inside." I closed my eyes for a moment, breathing deeply. The urge to protect him warred with the need to protect myself. But I knew, as Richard had known, that protection without accountability was not love. It was surrender. I would not surrender. That night, as Helen and Lily prepared to leave, Helen embraced me tightly. "You are not alone, Zara," she whispered. "We stand with you." Lily smiled, her notebook tucked under her arm, determination glowing in her expression. "We'll find everything we need," she promised. As I closed the door behind them, I felt a flicker of strength return. Ezra believed me weak, isolated, incapable of standing against him. What he did not know was that I had friends who embodied wisdom and truth, allies who carried both history and youth. And together, with Dalton's shield, Helen's wisdom, and Lily's fire, I would face him. I walked back into the great hall, the echoes of their voices still warming the air, and whispered to the portrait of Richard, "You left me more than a house. You left me people who remind me who I am." And for the first time since the funeral, I believed I might actually win. The days that followed moved quickly, every hour shadowed by the knowledge that Ezra was preparing his attack. Yet beneath his loud declarations and Claudia's smug confidence, something darker lurked. Lily had already uncovered traces of private loans hidden among Richard's files, but I sensed there was more. I could see it in Ezra's eyes whenever he looked at me, a flicker of fear that no arrogance could mask. It was the look of a man being hunted by something far greater than family disputes. Dalton came to the mansion one evening, carrying a slim folder under his arm. His expression was grim, though steady as always. "I think you need to see this," he said, laying the papers across the table. Lily followed him inside, her hair tied back, her notebook already open. She'd been digging into public records with a determination that reminded me of Richard's younger days. The two of them sat with me at the long oak table where Richard and I had once planned our future. Now we were piecing together the wreckage of our son's choices. Dalton adjusted his glasses and pointed to the first page. "These aren't ordinary debts. These are promissory notes signed with organizations that don't operate through banks. He borrowed from financial brokers who are known for their connections to organized crime. Look at the names here. Aliases. But they trace back to men who've been investigated for laundering and loan sharking." My throat tightened as I scanned the lines of figures. The numbers were staggering. Ezra had borrowed sums far beyond what he could ever repay through work or investment. It was clear now he had staked his future entirely on the mansion. To him, it wasn't simply an inheritance. It was collateral in a dangerous game. Lily leaned over the documents, her pen tapping against the margin. "These agreements aren't even legal in structure. They're designed to trap him. There are clauses that double the debt if payment is late. He's already defaulted on at least 2 of them. That means he's not just in debt. He's drowning." The air seemed to grow colder around us. I remembered Richard's warning. Hunger can consume a man until he cannot see anything but the object he believes will save him. Ezra was beyond hunger now. He was desperate. The men behind these debts would not care about sentiment, nor about funerals, nor about the dignity of family. They would come for repayment in whatever form they demanded. I pressed my hands together tightly to keep them from trembling. "He promised them the mansion," I said softly, more to myself than to the others. The image of him in Richard's study, hissing into the phone, came back with brutal clarity. "He told them it would all be his." Dalton nodded. "That explains the urgency." His declaration at the funeral wasn't just arrogance. It was survival. If he doesn't secure the deed, he has nothing to shield himself with. Lily's eyes flashed with both anger and pity. "But he's trying to use you as the shield. He wants you to bear the weight of debts you never created. He's gambling with your life as much as his own." The truth pierced deeper than I expected. Ezra's betrayal was no longer only about greed. It was about dragging me into the pit he had dug for himself. He wasn't just trying to seize the mansion. He was trying to save himself by offering it as ransom. I rose from the table and walked to the tall windows, the garden stretching out under the fading light. The roses swayed gently in the breeze, their thorns catching the glow of sunset. I thought of how many times I had pricked my fingers tending them, small wounds that healed quickly. This wound, though, was different. It cut into the deepest part of me, the place where motherly love and self-preservation collided. Behind me, Dalton's voice was calm but firm. "We need to be ready. He will likely move fast, filing claims, perhaps even manipulating the press to frame you as the obstacle. But the trust is airtight, and with evidence of these debts, we can show his motives clearly." Lily added, "I can continue digging. If we can trace the money trail, if we can tie it to names known for illegal practices, then it's more than just character evidence. It's proof that he is unfit to manage the estate." I turned back to them, my resolve hardening like stone. Do it. Find everything. If Richard took the time to protect me, then I must have the courage to stand in that protection. Ezra has made his choices. Now he must face them. The room fell quiet for a moment, the weight of what we uncovered settling on all of us. Dalton began gathering the papers again, his movements deliberate, careful. Lily scribbled notes furiously, her brow furrowed in concentration. I stood in the stillness, the folder of Richard's trust locked away in the drawer upstairs, and felt both fear and clarity. Fear because my son had entangled himself with wolves. Clarity because I finally understood the depth of the battle ahead. When they left later that evening, I walked alone through the great hall. The mansion loomed around me, its silence almost sentient. I placed my hand against the cool stone wall and whispered to Richard's memory, "You were right." He chose hunger. Now I must choose strength. I climbed the stairs slowly, my body heavy with grief, but my spirit steadier than it had been in weeks. Ezra's debts were no longer hidden. They were a shadow creeping closer, threatening to consume him. But shadows could not survive the light. With Dalton's shield and Lily's relentless search for truth, I would hold the light high, even if it blinded my own son. That night, as I closed my eyes, I no longer felt helpless. Betrayed, yes. Wounded deeply. But helpless? Number. Richard had sown the seeds of protection, and now the truth of Ezra's debts would water them into strength. The confrontation I had dreaded came sooner than I expected. It was late afternoon when I heard the heavy slam of a car door outside the mansion. The sun was beginning to dip, painting the sky in shades of fading gold. I stood at the window watching as Ezra strode up the path with Claudia beside him, her heels clicking sharply against the stone walkway. He didn't knock when he reached the front door. He pushed it open as though he already believed it belonged to him. I was waiting in the great hall, standing near Richard's portrait. The echoes of their footsteps filled the space, and when Ezra saw me, his mouth curved into something between a smirk and a snarl. "Mother," he said, drawing out the word as though it was a formality, "you've made things unnecessarily difficult." Claudia stepped forward first, her lips painted a perfect shade of red, her eyes glittering with calculation. "You know this isn't sustainable, Mrs. Whitmore," she said smoothly. "Ezra is the rightful heir, and all of this resistance only makes you look bitter. Why not make it easy for everyone? Sign the transfer, hand over the mansion, and you won't have to face the embarrassment when this goes public." I felt my heart harden at her words. The arrogance of a woman who had never planted a single flower in the gardens, never spent sleepless nights in these halls, never felt Richard's hand steady her through grief. She spoke as though the mansion were a dress she could pluck from a boutique rack. I looked at her, then back at Ezra. "This house was built by love, not greed," I said quietly. It is not yours to claim." Ezra laughed, but the sound was brittle, jagged at the edges. "Love doesn't pay debts, Mother. Love doesn't mean anything in court. I have people who will testify. I have documents. You can't keep this forever. You're clinging to the past while I build the future." "You're not building anything," I replied steadily. "You're burning everything left in your hands, and you want to drag me into the fire." His face twisted, anger flashing in his eyes. He stepped closer, lowering his voice as though to intimidate me. "If you don't hand over the deed, I'll make sure the world sees you for what you are. A selfish widow hoarding wealth that should pass to the next generation. Do you think the press will side with you? Do you think the courts will believe an old woman clinging to stone walls?" I didn't flinch. My fingers rested lightly on the folder resting on a nearby table. His eyes flicked toward it, suspicion clouding his expression. Claudia leaned in close to him, her phone already in her hand. "Ezra, let's get this recorded," she whispered. "Proof that she refuses." "It will look good in court." She raised the phone casually as though adjusting her hair, but I knew what she was doing. Her thumb hovered over the screen, capturing every word. Ezra straightened, puffing his chest, his voice loud now so the recording would capture it. "Fine," he said. "Let everyone hear it." "You're denying your only son his inheritance. You're choosing to betray your own blood." I let his words hang in the air, every syllable dripping with entitlement. Then I stepped closer, so close that Claudia's phone caught my face clearly. "What I am choosing," I said, my voice steady and cold, "is not to reward betrayal. You dishonor your father with every breath you take in this house. If you want to fight, fight in the open. I will not yield." The silence that followed was sharp. Claudia lowered the phone slightly, her expression flickering with unease. She had expected me to crumble, to plead, to defend myself weakly. Instead, I stood taller, my gaze unbroken. Ezra's jaw clenched, his knuckles white at his sides. "You'll regret this," he spat. "When the papers are filed and the headlines come, you'll see what happens when you defy me." I thought of the debts he carried, the men who waited for repayment that would never come. He was already drowning, yet he dared to throw stones at me from beneath the water. I pitied him, but I would not bend to him. Claudia touched his arm, urging him toward the door. "We should go," she murmured, her confidence waning under my silence. They turned, their footsteps echoing harshly against the marble as they left the hall. At the threshold, Ezra stopped and looked back at me one last time. His eyes burned with rage, but beneath it, I saw fear. He knew I wasn't the fragile woman he imagined. The door shut behind them, the sound reverberating through the mansion. I stood alone in the hall, my hand brushing against the edge of the folder. My heart pounded, but it wasn't fear, it was resolve. Ezra thought threats and recordings would weaken me. He was wrong. I whispered to Richard's portrait, "He doesn't know what you've left me. He doesn't know I am ready." The house seemed to breathe with me, its walls holding my words. The first confrontation had ended, but it was only the beginning of a larger battle. I knew Ezra would not stop. He would turn to courts, to newspapers, to anyone who would listen. Yet I also knew that Richard's foresight and my silence were stronger than his shouting. He had declared war in his father's house. I would answer, not with rage, but with the unshakable strength of truth. It didn't take long for Ezra to strike back. Within days of our confrontation in the great hall, whispers began to swirl beyond the walls of the mansion. Friends called me with uneasy voices, hinting that my name was being spoken in circles I had never entered. And then the newspapers arrived. Their bold headlines painted me as the villain, a greedy widow clinging to wealth that should have rightfully passed to her son. The words were cruel, sharpened to wound. They described me as cold, as selfish, even as a burden to the legacy Richard had built. I sat at the kitchen table one morning with the paper spread before me, my tea untouched. The photograph they had chosen stung almost more than the words themselves. It was taken at the funeral, my face pale with grief, my shoulders stiff as Ezra stood tall beside me. The caption read, "Mother blocks only son from family mansion." My hand trembled as I traced the ink, though anger steadied me quickly. Ezra was not only attacking me in court, he was poisoning the public's view, making strangers into his allies. Dalton arrived not long after with a copy of the petition Ezra had filed. His voice was calm, but the firmness in his eyes betrayed his own anger. "He's arguing incapacity," he said, sliding the papers toward me, "that you are unfit to manage the estate, that you're clinging to the property out of spite." Blackwood crafted the language carefully, just enough to sway a judge if we didn't have what we do. His glance flicked to the locked drawer upstairs, where the trust waited like a weapon untouched. I inhaled slowly, forcing my voice to remain even. So, this is his trap. If the public believes him, then the court may lean his way. Dalton nodded. "It's a tactic to pressure you into yielding before trial." "He wants you shamed." Into surrender Lily, who had joined us that morning, tapped her pen against her notebook, her eyes flashing with determination. "And Claudia is feeding it." I tracked the leak. "She's been sending recordings and statements to a journalist known for sensational stories. That explains why the coverage feels so one-sided." I closed the newspaper and set it aside. "Let them write what they will," I said softly. "Richard did not build this house on gossip, and I will not lose it to lies." But it was impossible to ignore the sting of humiliation. When I went into town for errands, I felt the stares of neighbors, some filled with sympathy, others with suspicion. A woman at the florist's shop whispered to another just a little too loudly, "Imagine keeping your own son from his father's mansion." I kept my head high, though inside my chest ached with every careless word. At night, I walked the mansion halls in silence, listening to the echoes of Ezra's trap tightening around me. I thought of Richard and what he would say if he could see how his son had turned the world against me. And then I thought of his last words about silence and strength. "You will know when to speak," he had said. That time was not yet here. For now, my resolve had to remain steady. One evening, as I sat in the study, Claudia's voice spilled from the television. She stood beside Ezra on the steps of the courthouse, her arm linked through his, her lips curled in practiced sorrow. "It is heartbreaking to watch a man denied his rightful inheritance," she said sweetly to the cameras. "Ezra adored his father, and this mansion is his legacy. We only hope his mother will find compassion in her heart before it's too late." I turned off the screen, unable to stomach another second. Her words were poison, dipped in honey, designed to sway a public that knew nothing of Richard's trust or Ezra's debts. I leaned back in Richard's chair, my hands gripping the armrests, my resolve deepening. Claudia thought her charm would win over the crowd. Ezra thought shame would drive me from the fight. They did not understand that the deeper they forced me into silence, the stronger that silence became. Dalton called that night. "Do not be afraid of their noise," he reminded me. "We have the truth, and the truth will stand." His voice calmed me, though the loneliness still pressed hard against my chest. The next morning, Lily arrived with a folder of her own. "I traced more of his debts," she said breathlessly. "There are connections to accounts in names that don't exist. It's a shell game, and it's collapsing. If we can bring this into court, it will crush his credibility." Her youthful determination lit something inside me that no headline could extinguish. Still, I could not deny the pain. Ezra had laid his trap well. By turning the court of public opinion against me, he had tried to strip me of dignity before the legal battle even began. Yet as I walked through the mansion that evening, brushing my fingers along the familiar walls, I realized the trap had not caught me. It had caught him. Every lie he spread, every headline he pushed, only revealed more of his desperation. I stood in the great hall looking up at Richard's portrait. "He's trying to bury me with shame," I whispered, "but he is burying himself instead." The house seemed to listen, the silence wrapping around me like armor. The storm outside was loud, but inside, I held steady. Ezra's trap was closing, but the trust was still locked safe in Dalton's hands, waiting for the right moment. When that moment came, no amount of lies could save him. Until then, I would endure. The morning after Claudia's performance on the courthouse steps, I sat at Richard's desk, staring at the folder that had been with me since the day he died. Its leather cover was smooth from years of Dalton's careful hands, its weight a constant reminder of the shield Richard had built for me. For days I had resisted the urge to open it fully, to study every page, as though doing so would make the battle real before its time. But now, with Ezra's petition filed and the newspapers poisoned by Claudia's words, the time had come. Dalton arrived just as the clock struck 10, his silver hair glinting in the morning light that streamed through the tall windows. He carried himself with the calm assurance of a man who had stood in courtrooms more times than I could count. He set his briefcase on the desk, but his eyes went straight to the folder. "It's time," he said simply. My hands trembled as I slid the folder across the desk to him. He opened it with care, as though it were not just paper, but a living thing, fragile and sacred. Lily arrived soon after, her notebook in hand, her youthful energy buzzing in the room. She leaned forward eagerly as Dalton spread the documents out, his finger tracing each clause with deliberate precision. "This," Dalton began, "is not just a will. It is a trust, carefully constructed years before Richard's health began to fail. He anticipated this day, perhaps not the details, but the possibility of conflict. He wanted to ensure that the mansion would remain secure, untouchable by greed or recklessness." I leaned closer, my eyes scanning the neat typeface, the bold headings, the signatures that bore Richard's steady hand. Every word seemed to carry his voice, as if he were speaking across time, reminding me of his foresight. Dalton continued, his voice even. "The trust removes the mansion from probate entirely. It cannot be contested in the way Ezra believes. He has filed a petition for inheritance, but the estate he seeks is not subject to that process. The mansion has already been secured under your name, with protections that even Blackwood will struggle to argue against." Relief washed over me, so powerful it left me breathless. For the first time since the funeral, I felt as though the ground beneath my feet had steadied. Yet it was not only relief I felt, it was sorrow too, sorrow that Richard had known his son well enough to prepare for betrayal. Lily's eyes lit with excitement as she flipped through the pages. "This is airtight," she said. "There are provisions against creditors, against forced sales, even against spousal claims. He must have spent months perfecting this." She looked at me with admiration. "Your husband wanted to protect you more than anything." Dalton nodded, his face grave but proud. "He trusted me to safeguard this until you needed it. And now, Zara, the time is here. Ezra believes he has cornered you, but in truth, he has only backed himself into a wall. When we present this in court, his arguments will crumble." I closed my eyes, letting the weight of that truth settle in me. For so long I had carried fear like a stone in my chest, fear of being stripped of the life Richard and I had built, fear of being left alone and vulnerable. Now that stone cracked, replaced by something steadier. Resolve. I reached for Richard's pen, still resting in its holder on the desk. I ran my fingers along its worn grooves, remembering how he used to tap it against his chin when he was lost in thought. "You knew," I whispered to the air, as if he could hear me still. "You knew our son's weakness before I allowed myself to see it. And you gave me the strength to stand against it." Dalton gathered the papers neatly, sliding them back into the folder with reverence. "Keep this with you until we meet in court," he said. "But remember, Zara, this is not just protection. This is victory waiting to be revealed. When the time comes, let the truth speak." Lily leaned closer, her eyes shining. "We should prepare for backlash. Ezra won't accept this quietly, but he can't undo what's already written. The law is on your side." I looked at both of them, my allies in this storm, and felt gratitude swell in my chest. "Thank you," I said softly, "for standing with me, for believing in me when my own son does not." That evening, I carried the folder upstairs to my room. I placed it on the bedside table, its presence like a sentinel watching over me. I lay in bed with the lamplight casting soft shadows across the walls, and I thought of Richard once more. He had not left me unarmed. He had left me with foresight, with allies, with a shield forged from love and law. Ezra believed his noise would drown me, but soon, when the court convened, he would hear the quiet thunder of Richard's legacy. It would not be shouted, it would not be dramatic, it would be steady, undeniable, final. I fell asleep that night with the folder inches from my hand, the sound of the wind against the windows, a lullaby. And for the first time since Richard's passing, I dreamed not of loss, but of strength. The house itself seemed to breathe easier, its walls settling as though they too knew that justice had already been written. The day of the hearing arrived with the weight of inevitability. I woke before dawn, the mansion quiet around me, the roses outside still heavy with dew. I dressed in black, not for mourning, but for resolve. A simple suit that Richard had once said made me look like the strongest woman in any room. When Dalton came to collect me, the folder was already in my hand, the leather warm from my touch. The courthouse was crowded, the air buzzing with reporters, photographers, and onlookers who had followed the story since Ezra first cried his grievances to the world. Flashbulbs burst like lightning as I walked up the stone steps, Dalton steady at my side. I kept my head high, refusing to give them the picture of a widow bowed by shame. Inside, the courtroom hummed with anticipation, the benches filled with curious strangers, a few familiar faces, and the ever-present whisper of judgment. Ezra was already there, seated beside Blackwood. He looked sharp in his suit, his tie knotted with care, but his eyes betrayed the storm within. Claudia sat just behind him, poised as though she were attending a gala, her gaze sharp and smug. When our eyes met, Ezra smirked, as if certain of victory. I returned his gaze calmly, my silence answering him more loudly than words. Judge Ramirez entered, his black robe flowing as he took his place at the bench. The murmurs died instantly, replaced by the weight of authority that filled the room. His reputation preceded him, fair, unyielding, and intolerant of theatrics. This was no stage for Ezra's performance. Blackwood rose first, his voice smooth and confident as he painted a picture of me as incapable. He spoke of age, of fragility, of a woman unable to carry the weight of such a vast estate. He gestured toward Ezra with practiced flourish. This is a son devoted to his father's legacy, ready to assume responsibility where his mother has faltered. His words slithered through the room, persuasive to those who did not know the truth. Ezra sat tall, his chin lifted, as though basking in the glow of his lawyer's praise. I could see Claudia's approving nod from the corner of my eye, her hand brushing his shoulder like a promise of triumph. For a moment, I felt the stares of the crowd pressing against me, some nodding, some whispering. The trap had been well laid. Then Dalton rose. His movements were slower, steadier, but his presence carried the kind of weight that no flourish could match. He adjusted his glasses, opened the folder and began with a calmness that silenced even the restless pens of the reporters. "Your Honor," he said, "the opposing counsel speaks of legacy, but we must ask, what did Richard Whitmore intend for his legacy to be? Was it to reward recklessness or to preserve dignity?" He laid the first page of the trust before the judge with deliberate care. The courtroom leaned forward as Judge Ramirez lifted the document, his eyes scanning the lines with precision. Dalton continued, his voice clear and unwavering. "This is not speculation. This is Richard Whitmore's trust, established years before his passing. It removes the mansion entirely from probate, placing it securely under Mrs. Whitmore's stewardship. This was his will not in theory but in law, executed with foresight and precision." Gasps rippled through the benches. Reporters scribbled furiously, their pens scratching across paper like the crackle of fire. Ezra's smirk faltered, his eyes darting between the document and his lawyer. Blackwood shifted uncomfortably, his polished confidence cracking as Dalton went on. "The son claims devotion," Dalton said, his voice sharpening slightly. "Yet his devotion is measured in debts, not duty. He has tied himself to obligations that threaten not only his name, but this very estate." Richard Whitmore anticipated such danger, and he prepared for it. He placed his trust where it would be honored, not squandered. Ezra slammed his hand on the table, his voice breaking the silence. "Lies! He's twisting everything. That house is mine." His outburst echoed, but Judge Ramirez's gavel struck sharply. "You will remain silent until spoken to." The authority in his voice silenced even the whispers in the gallery. Dalton handed over more pages, each one signed, dated, notarized, a fortress of legality no argument could breach. I watched as Judge Ramirez read, his expression unreadable but steady. Each moment felt like an eternity, the fate of Richard's legacy hanging in the balance of his measured eyes. When Dalton finished, he returned to his seat, his calm composure unbroken. The silence that followed was thick, every breath in the room held captive. Ezra fidgeted beside Blackwood, his earlier confidence draining as he realized the trap had turned. Claudia's face tightened, her lips pressed into a thin line. Judge Ramirez finally looked up, his gaze sweeping across the room before settling on Ezra. "This court acknowledges the validity of the trust presented," he said, his voice carrying the weight of finality. "The property in question is not subject to inheritance claims as argued. It is secured under Mrs. Whitmore's name, as was the explicit intent of her late husband." The words struck like a bell, clear and undeniable. I felt my chest loosen, the air rushing back into my lungs. Richard's foresight had spoken through the law, his promise fulfilled. Ezra sat frozen, his face pale, his hands trembling on the table. The courtroom buzzed again, reporters scrambling, whispers swelling like a tide. I sat still, my hands folded in my lap, my face calm. I did not smile, did not gloat. I only breathed, steady and quiet, as Richard had taught me. Victory did not need to be loud, it only needed to be true. The moment Judge Ramirez acknowledged the trust, the courtroom shifted like the ground had cracked beneath my son's feet. Ezra's face drained of color, his mouth opening and closing as though he could not believe the words he had just heard. Blackwood leaned close to him, whispering frantically, but Ezra's eyes darted wildly, searching for some thread of control that had already slipped away. For the first time, I saw fear unmasked in him, raw and unsteady. He slammed his fist against the table, his voice rising until it cracked. "This is fraud! She manipulated Father in his final days. She poisoned him against me. That house was meant for me." His words tumbled into the air with the force of desperation, echoing across the wooden panels of the courtroom. The judge raised his gavel again, sharp and commanding, but Ezra continued, his face twisted with rage. "You all think she's some saint," he spat, pointing at me with a trembling hand. "But you don't know her." She controlled him. She controlled everything. My father trusted me until she whispered in his ear, and now look, now I'm painted as the villain. His voice cracked on the last word, and for a moment the silence that followed carried the weight of years of resentment poured out in one reckless torrent. I sat motionless, my hands folded, my face calm. Inside, however, my heart ached. My son, my only child, stood before the world unraveling, his pride shredding itself into pieces. Lily, seated just behind me, rose quietly with a folder of her own. She handed it to Dalton, who passed it forward with deliberate care. "Your Honor," Dalton said, his voice even, "we anticipated this argument." But what my client's son fails to mention is the financial trail that undermines his claim of devotion. Judge Ramirez gestured for him to continue. Dalton opened the folder, revealing documents Lily had uncovered. Bank records, loan agreements, names tied to dangerous circles. He laid them one by one before the bench, each page a stone added to the weight, crushing Ezra's defense. "This is the reality," Dalton said. "The petitioner is not motivated by loyalty to his father. He is drowning in debts to entities well beyond the reach of lawful institutions. He promised the mansion as payment long before his father's death. This is not devotion. This is desperation." Gasps rippled across the gallery. Reporters leaned forward, their pens racing, their cameras snapping. The words debts and desperation buzzed through the crowd like bees stirred from a hive. I could feel the air shift, judgment tilting decisively against Ezra. Ezra's hands shook as he grabbed the papers, crumpling one in his fist. "Lies," he shouted. "This is fabricated." "You're all against me. She planned this, with you, with all of you. You want to see me ruined." His voice cracked again, higher this time, unsteady. Claudia reached for his arm, her face tight with unease, but he shoved her hand away, his eyes wild. I had never seen him like this, not even in his most reckless years. He was unraveling before everyone, his pride tearing into madness. "Father promised me," he screamed, his voice hoarse now. "He said it would all be mine." She tricked him. She tricked you all. I am his son. I am his blood. Judge Ramirez's gavel struck hard, the sound reverberating through the tense air. "Mr. Whitmore," the judge said firmly, "compose yourself. This court will not tolerate baseless accusations or disruptive conduct." But Ezra could not compose himself. He was past reason, past dignity. I sat still, my heart breaking even as my resolve grew sharper. This was the boy I had rocked to sleep, the young man I had prayed for through long nights. And now he stood as a stranger, his desperation laid bare, his dignity shredded in front of a watching world. Yet even through my grief, I knew this unraveling was not mine to stop. He had chosen this path, and now he bore its weight. Lily leaned closer to me, whispering softly, "This is the truth coming to light. Hold steady." Her voice steadied me, reminding me that silence remained my greatest strength. I did not need to answer his accusations. The truth was already louder than his shouting. Ezra's outburst continued until finally the bailiff stepped forward, his broad frame casting a shadow over my son. Only then did Ezra slump back into his chair, his face pale, his hands trembling as though he had just fought a war against ghosts. He muttered under his breath, but the fire in his eyes had dimmed into something darker, fear mixed with shame. Judge Ramirez adjusted his glasses, his tone measured and cold. "The documents will be entered into the record. The evidence of debts is clear. The court will weigh this alongside the trust." He paused, his gaze steady on Ezra. "I strongly advise you to regain control of yourself if you wish to be heard further." The silence that followed was suffocating. Reporters exchanged glances, already scribbling the story that would make headlines by morning. The son who unraveled under the weight of his own lies. Claudia sat stiffly, her lips pressed thin, her eyes calculating as though already reassessing her place beside him. I closed my eyes briefly, whispering inwardly to Richard, "You saw this coming. You knew what he would become. You gave me the strength to endure, and now the truth is laying him bare." When I opened my eyes again, I felt steadier than ever. Ezra's spiral had begun, and no amount of noise could undo what had already been revealed. When Ezra finally collapsed into his chair, pale and trembling, I thought the storm inside the courtroom might subside. But the quiet that followed was heavier than thunder. Every eye was still on him, and he knew it. His pride had shattered in front of strangers, and yet he still tried to sit tall, his jaw clenched tight. Claudia, seated just behind him, no longer touched his arm or whispered encouragement. She sat frozen, her face unreadable, her hands folded neatly in her lap. I watched her carefully. She was never one to linger beside a sinking ship for long. Judge Ramirez called for a short recess, and people spilled into the hallways. Reporters swarmed near the doors, cameras flashing as whispers carried like smoke. I remained seated, calm, while Dalton leaned toward me. "Stay composed. The walls are closing in on him, but we must let the law finish the work." I nodded, steadying myself. The folder with the trust still rested secure in Dalton's briefcase, but I no longer needed to cling to it as armor. The truth was already unfolding in plain sight. When the court resumed, Ezra seemed diminished. His tie was loosened, his hair slightly disheveled, his eyes darting as if searching for a lifeline. Claudia's gaze lingered on him only briefly before she turned her attention forward, her expression cool. Then, in a move none of us expected, she stood when Judge Ramirez asked if there were any additional submissions. "Your Honor," she said, her voice clear and steady, "I have something the court should hear." The gallery erupted in murmurs. Ezra turned sharply toward her, his face a mask of disbelief. "Claudia, sit down," he hissed, his voice low but urgent. But she ignored him, stepping toward the bailiff with a small flash drive in her hand. The judge raised an eyebrow. "State your name for the record." "Claudia Reynolds," she replied. "I was present during several private conversations with Ezra Whitmore. I have a recording that may be relevant to these proceedings." Gasps broke out again, louder this time. Ezra lunged halfway out of his chair. "Claudia, don't you dare!" he shouted, but the bailiff had already taken the drive, handing it to the clerk. The judge gestured for it to be played. The speakers crackled to life, filling the courtroom with the unmistakable sound of Ezra's voice. "The mansion is just a ticket out," he said in the recording, his tone sharp and hurried. "Once it's in my name, the debts disappear." "Claudia, you know it. That house isn't about family or legacy. It's leverage. My mother can rot in it for all I care. What matters is using it to buy freedom." The words rang out like a hammer striking steel. My chest tightened, but I kept my face steady. The gallery erupted in shocked whispers, reporters nearly leaping to their feet as they scribbled and typed. Judge Ramirez struck his gavel for order, but the damage was already done. Ezra's face turned crimson. He spun toward Claudia, his voice breaking. "You set me up! You betrayed me!" His hand shook as he pointed at her, but she remained calm, her chin lifted high. "I protected myself," she said coolly. "You dragged me into your lies, your debts, your promises to men I wanted no part of. I will not be destroyed because you couldn't keep your word." Her words sliced through the room with finality. Ezra staggered back into his chair, his mouth open but no sound escaping. For the first time, I saw him not as my son, or even as my enemy, but as a man utterly undone by his own choices. Claudia had stood beside him as long as she thought he might win, but the moment victory slipped away, she turned, delivering the final cut. I looked at her, searching for malice, but what I saw was survival. She had never loved him, not truly. She had loved the promise of wealth, the glow of status. Once those promises crumbled, so did her loyalty. I should have felt anger, but instead I felt a hollow kind of pity. Ezra had bound himself to someone who mirrored his own hunger, and in the end, hunger consumes itself. Dalton leaned toward me, whispering softly, "This seals it." His credibility is gone, Lily, seated just behind me, scribbled furiously in her notebook, her eyes wide with both shock and satisfaction. Ezra buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking, though whether from rage or despair I could not tell. The courtroom had shifted fully now. The whispers that once questioned me now condemned him. The son who had declared ownership at his father's funeral was stripped bare, his words betraying him in his own voice. When Judge Ramirez finally restored order, his gaze was heavy on Ezra. "This recording will be admitted. The court cannot ignore the clear intent expressed within it. Your motivations are evident and they will weigh heavily in my decision." Ezra did not respond. He sat slumped, broken, staring at the table as though it could offer him escape. Claudia returned to her seat, her posture poised, her face serene, as though she had merely adjusted her position in a game she had always intended to win. I breathed deeply, steadying myself. The betrayal I had feared from Ezra was now complete, but it had not come from me. It had come from the very woman he had trusted to stand beside him. For a fleeting moment, my heart ached for the boy he once was, the boy who had held my hand during thunderstorms. But that boy was gone, replaced by the man now unraveling before the world. The courtroom settled into silence again, the weight of Claudia's revelation still hanging in the air. I folded my hands in my lap, my face calm, my heart steady. Richard's foresight had protected me. Dalton's loyalty had shielded me. Lily's determination had strengthened me. And now Ezra's own choices had condemned him. The end was near. The courtroom was silent when the recording ended. Ezra sat slumped in his chair, his face buried in his hands, while Claudia looked straight ahead as though she had merely brushed dust from her sleeve. I could feel the air grow heavier, every person present holding their breath, as Judge Ramirez adjusted his glasses and leaned forward. His gavel tapped lightly against the wood, not in anger, but as a reminder that the room now belonged to him alone. "Enough," he said firmly. His voice carried the weight of years on the bench, a voice that had seen countless lives unravel in the pursuit of power and greed. This court has heard the arguments, reviewed the evidence, and listened to testimony both spoken and recorded. What has been revealed here is not a matter of inheritance, but of protection. Protection of a legacy that was deliberately secured through foresight. He lifted the trust papers once again, his hand steady as he turned each page. Richard Whitmore established this trust long before his passing. It was signed, witnessed, notarized, and filed in accordance with the law. Its intent is clear. The mansion and the protections around it belong solely to Mrs. Zara Whitmore. No further claim may override that decision. The words struck through the room with the finality of a closing door. I sat very still, my hands folded in my lap, though inside my chest my heart beat with a mixture of relief and sorrow. Richard's voice seemed to echo in the steady cadence of the judge's ruling. Judge Ramirez set the documents down and looked directly at Ezra. His tone hardened. "Mr. Whitmore, you have not only failed to prove your case, but you have exposed your own motives. This court cannot ignore the evidence of your financial entanglements and your attempt to leverage this property to escape debts. Nor can it ignore the recording in which you made those motives plain. Your actions dishonor the very legacy you claim to protect." Ezra lifted his head slightly, his face pale, his eyes glassy. He opened his mouth as though to argue, but the judge raised his hand sharply. "No more outbursts. You have spoken enough. This ruling is final." The gavel came down with a decisive crack that reverberated through the wood and stone of the chamber. The petition is denied. The mansion and all assets under the trust remain under the stewardship of Mrs. Whitmore. Furthermore, this court rules that any creditors seeking restitution must direct their claims solely toward Mr. Whitmore and not the trust or its beneficiary. This estate is shielded from such obligations by design. The room erupted into murmurs, reporters scribbling furiously, cameras flashing like a sudden storm of light. I felt Dalton's steady hand rest briefly on mine, a quiet reassurance that the battle had been won. Lily sat just behind me, her eyes shining with the pride of someone who had fought alongside me. Ezra, however, looked as though the ground had collapsed beneath him, his face twisted with disbelief, his lips forming silent protests that never found sound. Claudia leaned away from him, her expression detached, as if she no longer had any part in his ruin. Blackwood gathered his papers stiffly, his jaw clenched, his polished confidence broken. Judge Ramirez continued, his tone softer now but no less commanding. This court acknowledges the pain of family disputes such as this, but let it be clear, the law does not reward greed, nor does it punish foresight. Mr. Whitmore, your father acted out of love and wisdom. He entrusted his legacy to the person who had stood beside him all his life. That choice will be honored here. His gaze flicked to me then, and though his expression remained stern, I sensed a trace of respect in his eyes. Mrs. Whitmore, this court upholds your rights as the sole beneficiary of the trust. May you carry this legacy with the dignity that has been evident throughout these proceedings. My throat tightened, but I bowed my head slightly in acknowledgement. I would not weep, not here, not in front of Ezra. This victory was not triumph to be shouted, but justice delivered in quiet strength. The gavel struck once more, final and echoing. Court is adjourned. The sound unleashed a flurry of movement. Reporters rushed toward the exits, eager to send their stories into the world. Lawyers shuffled papers, voices rose and fell, but I sat still in my chair, breathing slowly, letting the verdict settle deep inside me. Ezra remained frozen, his eyes unfocused, his hands limp at his sides. For a brief moment I saw not the man who had betrayed me, but the boy who once clutched my hand in crowded rooms. But the moment passed. Choices had been made, and consequences had followed. Dalton leaned close. It is done, Zara. Richard's foresight carried you through. You are free. The word echoed inside me as I rose to my feet, the trust secure, the mansion protected, my dignity intact. I walked past Ezra without speaking, his eyes darting toward me as though pleading silently for something I could no longer give. I kept my gaze forward, steady, carrying Richard's memory with me like a shield. Outside the courthouse, the sky had cleared, sunlight spilling across the steps where cameras still flashed. For the first time in weeks, I did not dread the lenses pointed at me. Let them take their pictures. Let the world see not a widow clinging to the past, but a woman who had endured, who had been tested and had not broken. The verdict was more than words written into the record. It was Richard's final promise, honored and complete, and it was mine to carry forward. The mansion was quiet again, as if the very walls had exhaled after weeks of holding their breath. The trial was behind me, the verdict final, and yet the silence of the house felt heavier than before. Richard's portrait watched me from the great hall, his calm eyes reminding me that dignity had been preserved. But victory did not erase the ache of loss. It only carved out a new space inside me where both relief and sorrow coexisted. I spent the evening walking through the rooms, my hand trailing along the woodwork, listening to the faint hum of memory that lingered in every corner. The trust had saved me, but it had not saved Ezra from himself. I wondered if Richard would have grieved or raged to see his only son so undone. Perhaps both. As for me, I felt the weight of motherhood pressing harder than the gavel had. Night settled in, soft at first, then darker as the lamps flickered to life across the mansion. I sat in the parlor, with a cup of tea cooling in my hand, staring into the quiet glow of the fireplace. The flames moved gently, casting shadows that seemed to stretch longer than they should. I had almost drifted into a kind of numb peace when it came. The knock. It was not loud, not insistent, just 3 firm raps against the heavy oak of the front door. The sound echoed down the hall, breaking the stillness. I froze, my cup trembling in my hand. I knew before I rose who it would be. There are knocks a mother knows, even when her heart begs her to be wrong. I walked slowly to the door, each step weighted with memory. When I placed my hand on the cold brass handle, I paused, my breath caught in my throat. Another knock followed, softer this time, almost pleading. I opened the door just enough to see him. Ezra stood there, shoulders slumped, his face gaunt under the porch light. The arrogance he had carried into every room was gone. His eyes, once sharp with entitlement, were hollow, rimmed with red. He looked not like the man who had shouted at me in court, but like a boy who had lost everything. For a fleeting moment, I saw the child who used to run down these very steps, laughing, his arms stretched wide for me to catch him. "Mother," he whispered, his voice cracked and thin. "Please, I have nowhere else to go." The words pierced me deeper than any headline, deeper than any accusation he had hurled. My hand tightened on the door, the wood pressing into my palm. Behind him, the night stretched wide and empty, and I could almost feel the weight of the debts and shame pressing down on his shoulders. He was broken, yes, but not repentant, not yet. His eyes begged for shelter, not forgiveness. I wanted to pull him inside, to wrap him in the warmth of the house, to tell him that despite everything, he was still my son. But then, I remembered the funeral, his voice echoing through the sanctuary as he declared I had nothing, that the mansion was his. I remembered the courtroom, the venom in his words, the way he called me a manipulator, a fraud, unworthy of what Richard and I had built. I remembered the years of indulgence, the lies, the debts, and the betrayal that cut deeper than any wound. I placed my other hand on the door, bracing myself against the weight of what I had to do. "Ezra," I said softly, my voice steady though my heart shook, "this house is not a refuge from the choices you made. It is not a shield from your debts, nor a prize for your pride. It is a legacy your father built, and you dishonored it." His eyes widened, his lips parting as though to argue, but no words came. The silence between us stretched long, broken only by the whisper of the wind through the rose bushes outside. For a moment he pressed his hand against the doorframe, his fingers trembling. "Please," he whispered again, but this time weaker, as if even he knew the answer before it came. I lifted my hand from the handle and placed it flat against the door. "I cannot open this for you," I said quietly. "Not tonight. Not like this." My voice cracked then, just slightly, the mother in me straining against the woman I had become. Ezra's hand slipped away from the frame. He stepped back, his face collapsing into something I could hardly bear to see. Without another word, he turned and walked into the darkness, his figure swallowed by the night. The sound of his footsteps faded, leaving only silence. I stood there with my hand still on the door, my chest rising and falling with the weight of what had just passed. Tears blurred my vision, but I did not open the door again. Some wounds cannot be healed by shelter. Some lessons must be carried in the cold. When I finally stepped back, I whispered to the empty hall, "Richard, I hope you understand. I hope he will too." Someday the house was silent, but I felt its walls hold me steady as I turned away. I walked back to the parlor, the fire still glowing softly. I sat in Richard's chair, pulling a shawl around my shoulders, and let the warmth seep into me. The night outside was dark, but inside I remained firm, steady, unbroken. Ezra had knocked, and I had answered in silence, not cruelty. That silence would echo longer than any word I could have spoken. The days after Ezra's knock passed in a strange kind of quiet. The house seemed to hold its breath, as if even the walls knew something final had closed that night. I moved through the rooms without fear now, without the gnawing dread that had haunted me since Richard's funeral. The trust had held, the verdict had been delivered, and the mansion was safe. Yet what lingered was not triumph, but something gentler, something like release. I woke one morning with the decision already in my heart. Richard's legacy was more than stone walls and carved wood. It was meant to be alive, to reach beyond bloodlines that had turned brittle with greed. So I sat at Richard's desk, the same desk where the trust had been spread open, and drafted the first papers for what I called the Whitmore Foundation. Its purpose would be simple but profound: to preserve, to protect, and to give. Education for young people burdened by the mistakes of those before them. Housing for widows left adrift in silence. Gardens for communities that had forgotten beauty. Richard had always said the mansion should be a place of life, not merely a monument. Now it would become exactly that. Dalton helped me file the documents. Helen smiled when I told her, her eyes soft with approval. "You're not just surviving, Zara," she said, resting her hand on mine. "You're creating." That's the difference between living in grief and living in strength. Lily clapped her hands in delight, already eager to volunteer her time, her youth blending with my resolve like sunlight across old stone. For the first time, I felt the mansion breathe again. One evening, as the sun bled orange across the horizon, Dalton brought me a smaller folder, one I had not seen before. He handed it to me gently, his eyes solemn. "Richard left this with me as well," he said. My hands trembled slightly as I opened it. Inside was not another legal document, but a single handwritten letter, Richard's familiar script flowing across the page. "Zara," it began, "if you are reading this, it means the time has come for you to stand alone. But you are never truly alone, my love. You are the keeper of our legacy, not because of laws or trusts, but because of who you are. Our mansion was never built for a son's pride or a court's judgment. It was built from every stone we laid together, from every night we dreamed beneath its roof. Carry it forward with grace. Let it be more than shelter. Let it be light." I pressed the paper to my chest, tears spilling freely for the first time since the trial ended. Not tears of fear or humiliation, but tears of gratitude, of love that endured even past death. Richard's voice filled the silence of the room, steady as ever, reminding me that the battles I had fought were not only for myself, but for the legacy we shared. At the next community gathering, held in the Great Hall, I opened the doors of the mansion wide. Neighbors, friends, and even some who had once whispered against me walked through, their faces softened by curiosity and reverence. I stood before them, not as a widow guarding wealth, but as a woman offering renewal. I announced the Whitmore Foundation, and as I spoke, I saw eyes widen, lips tremble, shoulders relax. The mansion no longer belonged only to the Whitmores. It belonged to the future. As the guests filtered out, one elderly man paused at the doorway. He had been at Richard's funeral, though I had not spoken with him then. He looked at me with quiet respect and said, "Richard would be proud of you." The words sank deep, carrying both comfort and confirmation. I smiled softly, my heart swelling with a peace I had not known for years. Later that night, I walked through the gardens alone. The roses glowed pale under the moonlight, their fragrance mingling with the cool night air. I touched one bloom gently, its petals soft beneath my fingers, its thorns sharp but honest. It reminded me of life itself, pain and beauty bound together, inseparable, each giving meaning to the other. I whispered to the night, "Richard, we did it. Your legacy lives." And so do I. As I returned to the mansion, I paused at the door, the same door where Ezra had once knocked in desperation. I placed my hand flat against the wood, feeling its solid strength. I did not regret closing it that night. Some doors must remain shut until the person on the other side chooses to change. Whether Ezra ever would, I did not know. But I had chosen my path, and it was no longer chained to his. Inside, the fire in the hearth burned low, casting a golden glow across the hall. I sat in Richard's chair one last time, folding his letter carefully and placing it beside me. The house no longer felt like a battleground. It felt like a sanctuary again. And I, no longer just a widow or a victim, felt like someone reborn. The silence that once weighed on me now felt different. It was no longer empty. It was full. Full of memory, full of strength, full of possibility. I closed my eyes and let it wash over me, steady and healing. The woman I had been at Richard's funeral was gone. In her place stood someone new, someone tempered by grief, betrayal, and resilience, someone who had learned that even the quietest voice could carry the weight of justice. This was my silent rebirth.